Tell us in the comments where you're watching from right now. What city? What country? We want to know how far this story reaches. Because this is a story about a wall, a false wall, built in the main hall of a farmhouse in Virginia. Behind that wall, between 1847 and 1859, 87 fugitive slaves hid while bounty hunters searched the house. 87 people. Some stayed hours, some stayed weeks, some stayed pressed against that wall, barely breathing, while slave catchers stood 3 feet away eating dinner and boasting about their latest captures. The couple who built that wall were criminals, according to Virginia law. He was an escaped slave named Marcus Freeman, 32 years old when the story begins, who should have been captured and returned to bondage or killed. She was a white woman named Elizabeth Garrett, 28 years old, who should have been ostracized and imprisoned for helping fugitives. Together, they created the most audacious hiding place in Underground Railroad history. Not in a basement, not in an attic, but behind a false wall in the main room of their house, the room where they entertained guests, where slave catchers sat and drank coffee, where Virginia sheriffs conducted searches. 87 fugitives passed through that wall. 87 people who should have been caught, and not one was ever found. This is the story of Marcus and Elizabeth Freeman. This is the story of 12 years of perfect deception. This is the story of a wall that saved lives and a love that defied every law and custom of the American South. And it starts with a question that changed everything. What if the best hiding place is the one no one would ever search? 1847, Loudoun County, Virginia, 15 miles from the Maryland border. The landscape was rolling hills covered in oak and hickory forests, dotted with tobacco plantations that generated enormous wealth for a few white families and enormous suffering for the 2,000 enslaved people who worked those fields. 3 plantations dominated the area. The Morrison Plantation to the east, 600 acres, 132 enslaved people. The Crawford Plantation to the south, 800 acres, 170 enslaved people. The Whitfield Plantation to the west, 700 acres, 151 enslaved people. Between these 3 plantations, in a small valley accessible by a single dirt road, sat a modest farm. 40 acres, a 2-story wooden farmhouse, a barn, a chicken coop, tobacco fields that produced barely enough to survive. The farm was owned, according to county records, by Elizabeth Freeman, a white widow whose husband had died in 1846, leaving her the property. No one questioned this. Widows owning small farms were not uncommon. What was uncommon, what was actually illegal and punishable by years in prison, was that Elizabeth Freeman was not a widow. Her husband, Marcus, was very much alive. He lived with her openly. And Marcus Freeman was black. Marcus Freeman was born enslaved in 1815 on the Morrison Plantation. His mother was a field hand named Sarah. His father was the plantation blacksmith named Thomas. Marcus grew up learning his father's trade. By age 15, in 1830, he was the best blacksmith in Loudoun County. Master Andrew Morrison recognized this skill and hired Marcus out to other plantations and farms, collecting Marcus's wages but allowing Marcus to keep a small percentage. By 1840, Marcus had saved $83, not nearly enough to purchase his freedom, which Morrison valued at $1,200, but enough to begin thinking about escape. The trigger came in January 1845. Marcus's father, Thomas, was kicked by a horse and died from internal injuries. His mother, Sarah, died 2 months later from pneumonia, though Marcus believed she died from grief. Within 3 months, Marcus had lost both parents. He was 30 years old. He had no wife, no children, no family left at Morrison Plantation. And he realized that he could spend the next 30 years working as a slave, dying as a slave, or he could risk everything for a chance at freedom. On March 15, 1845, Marcus Freeman walked away from Morrison Plantation. He didn't run. He walked. It was a Tuesday. Morrison had hired him out to repair tools at a farm 12 miles away. Marcus finished the job, collected the payment for Morrison, and instead of returning to the plantation, he walked north. He knew the route. He had studied it for years during his hiring out jobs. He knew which farms were sympathetic. He knew which roads the slave catchers patrolled. He knew that his best chance was to move slowly, carefully, invisibly. He reached the Maryland border in 4 days. He crossed into Pennsylvania in another 3. He was a fugitive. Free, but hunted. Master Morrison posted a reward, $50 for Marcus's capture and return. Slave catchers began searching. Marcus kept moving north. He reached Philadelphia in April 1845. The city had a large free black community and an active underground railroad network. Marcus found work as a blacksmith under an assumed name. He saved money. He learned to read and write with help from a Quaker woman who ran a school for free black children. He attended meetings of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, an organization that helped fugitive slaves escape to Canada. And in August 1845, at one of these meetings, Marcus met Elizabeth Garrett. Elizabeth was 26 years old. She had been born in 1819 in Loudoun County, Virginia, daughter of a small tobacco farmer named William Garrett, who owned no slaves and opposed slavery on religious grounds. William Garrett was a Quaker, part of a small community of anti-slavery whites in Northern Virginia. He taught his daughter that slavery was evil, that all people were equal before God, that helping fugitives was a moral duty. When William Garrett died in 1843, he left his 40-acre farm to Elizabeth with explicit instructions. Use it to help people escape. Elizabeth had been doing exactly that for 2 years, hiding fugitives in her barn, feeding them, sending them north to Maryland and Pennsylvania. She had helped 16 people escape by the time she met Marcus. She traveled to Philadelphia regularly to coordinate with the Vigilance Committee, bringing money raised by sympathetic Virginians and carrying coded messages about safe routes. Marcus and Elizabeth met at a committee meeting in August 1845. She was immediately struck by his intelligence and quiet intensity. He was immediately struck by her courage and commitment. They began talking after meetings, then meeting separately for longer conversations. By October 1845, they were in love. This created a profound problem. Interracial relationships were illegal in Virginia, illegal and socially unacceptable and dangerous. A white woman with a black man would be ostracized, possibly imprisoned, certainly ruined socially and economically. A black man with a white woman would be killed, lynched, burned, mutilated as a warning to others. Marcus knew this. Elizabeth knew this. They discussed returning to Canada, where such relationships, while still controversial, were not illegal. But Elizabeth owned the farm in Virginia. The farm was perfectly positioned between 3 major plantations. The farm was already being used to hide fugitives. Moving to Canada meant abandoning that strategic location. Marcus proposed something different, something audacious. What if they both returned to Virginia? What if Elizabeth continued to own the farm legally as a white widow? What if Marcus lived there with her but posed as her hired black servant? It was risky, extremely risky, but it might work. White widows hiring black laborers was not uncommon. As long as they were careful, as long as Marcus played the role of obedient servant in public, as long as they never showed affection where others could see, they might survive. And they could use the farm not just to hide fugitives temporarily, but to create something unprecedented. A permanent station with a black conductor who understood fugitives' fears and a white owner who could deflect suspicion. They decided to try. In November 1845, Elizabeth returned to Virginia alone. She told neighbors her time in Philadelphia had been visiting relatives and conducting business. She resumed farming. She attended church. She maintained her reputation as a respectable Christian widow. In January 1846, she hired a Negro servant named Marcus, a free black man with papers showing he'd been manumitted by a Maryland family. The papers were forged. The Vigilance Committee had provided them. As far as Virginia law was concerned, Marcus Freeman was a free black man legally employed by a white woman. This fiction would last 13 years. Marcus and Elizabeth married in a secret ceremony in February 1846. No legal marriage, no public announcement, just the two of them in the farmhouse, speaking vows before God. They lived as husband and wife privately, and as employer and servant publicly. The strain was enormous. In public, Marcus called her Miss Elizabeth. He ate meals separately. He never made eye contact for too long. He obeyed her orders even when those orders were performances for guests. Elizabeth called him Marcus, never any term of endearment. She treated him with professional distance. They never touched in public. This performance had to be flawless because their lives depended on it. But privately, at night, behind closed doors, they were Marcus and Elizabeth, husband and wife, partners, lovers. They began improving the Underground Railroad operations immediately. The barn where Elizabeth had been hiding fugitives was too obvious. Slave catchers always searched barns. They needed something better, something unexpected. Marcus proposed building a false wall, not in the barn, not in the basement, in the main hall. The idea seemed insane. The main hall was the first room people entered. It was where Elizabeth entertained guests. It was where, inevitably, slave catchers would search. Building a hiding place there was like hiding in plain sight at its most extreme. But Marcus's logic was sound. Slave catchers expected hidden spaces in barns, basements, attics. They never expected hidden spaces in the main living areas because no one would be that bold. And if the wall was built perfectly, if it looked completely natural, if there was no evidence of construction, it would be invisible. Marcus spent 3 months designing and building the wall. The main hall was 20 feet by 18 feet with a fireplace on the north wall. Marcus built a false wall parallel to the east wall, creating a hidden space exactly 3 feet deep and 15 feet long. The hidden space could hold up to 10 people standing, pressed together. The entrance was behind a bookshelf that swung open on hidden hinges. The bookshelf was filled with real books, making it seem like permanent furniture. The wall itself was constructed with perfect craftsmanship. Marcus used the same wood as the existing walls. He matched the paint exactly. He aged the wood so it looked decades old. He installed the wall in sections over multiple nights, working silently so no one would hear. He created ventilation using existing chimney flues that were hidden behind the structure. By April 1847, the false wall was complete. From outside or inside the main hall, it was completely invisible. The room looked normal. The dimensions seemed correct. There was no evidence that 3 feet of space had been stolen from the room. It was a masterpiece of carpentry and deception. And it was about to be tested. May 1847. The first fugitive to use the wall arrived at midnight, a man named Jacob, aged 28, who had escaped from Morrison Plantation. Jacob was terrified. He knew slave catchers would search the area. He knew the Garretts, knew Elizabeth's father had been sympathetic. He came begging for help. Marcus opened the bookshelf. Jacob stared at the hidden space. Marcus explained, "You'll hide here if catchers come. Could be hours, could be days. You stay silent, you don't move, you don't cough, you barely breathe. Can you do that? Jacob nodded. He stayed in the farmhouse for 3 days while Marcus and Elizabeth monitored the roads. On the third day, 2 slave catchers arrived. They knocked on the door. Elizabeth answered with perfect composure. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. How can I help you?" The taller man showed her a poster. $50 reward for Jacob. "We're looking for a runaway nigger, young male about this height. You seen anyone like that?" Elizabeth studied the poster. "I have not, but you're welcome to search my property if you'd like." This was the moment. Jacob was in the main hall behind the wall. The slave catchers entered the main hall. They looked around. They walked the perimeter. They stood 3 feet from Jacob, separated only by the false wall. Jacob later said he could hear them breathing. He could smell the tobacco one was chewing. He pressed himself flat against the back wall of the hidden space, trying to become invisible, trying not to breathe. The slave catcher examined the room. He knocked on the east wall. The real east wall, not the false one. It sounded solid. He looked at the bookshelf. It looked permanent, filled with books, clearly not something that moved. "Nothing here," he said. They searched the rest of the house. The bedrooms upstairs, the kitchen, the root cellar. They searched the barn. They searched the fields. They found nothing. They left. Jacob remained behind the wall for another 2 hours until Marcus was certain the catchers were gone. Then Marcus opened the bookshelf and Jacob emerged, shaking, covered in sweat. "That worked," Jacob said. "That actually worked." 3 days later, Marcus and Elizabeth helped Jacob reach Maryland. He eventually made it to Canada. The wall had passed its first test. Over the next 12 years, it would be tested 86 more times. The pattern was always the same. Fugitives would arrive, usually at night, sent by other Underground Railroad conductors who knew the Freeman's farm was safe. Some fugitives stayed one night. Some stayed weeks, waiting for safe passage north. During their stay, Marcus and Elizabeth would provide food, clothing, forged travel documents, and, most importantly, the psychological support needed to survive the trauma of escape. Many fugitives arrived broken, terrified, traumatized by the violence they'd experienced and the violence they knew would come if they were caught. Marcus understood this fear in ways Elizabeth never could. He had lived it. He spoke to fugitives not as a helper but as someone who had walked the same path. He told them about his own escape. He told them about the wall. He told them that if slave catchers came, they would survive. This assurance mattered immensely to people who had lost faith that survival was possible. But the wall was only safe if it was used correctly. Marcus developed strict protocols refined through painful trial and error. When fugitives were in the house and someone unexpected approached, Elizabeth would say a code phrase. "Marcus, please bring tea." This meant slave catchers coming, everyone into the wall immediately. Marcus would open the bookshelf by pressing a hidden lever disguised as a decorative carving. The bookshelf would swing inward silently on oiled hinges. Fugitives would file into the hidden space quickly but carefully, arranging themselves to maximize capacity. Tall people in back, shorter people in front, children held by adults, everyone standing because there was no room to sit. The bookshelf would close. Marcus would lock it from outside using another hidden mechanism. Then Marcus and Elizabeth would conduct their performance with Academy Award-level skill. Sometimes slave catchers came once and left. Sometimes they came back hours later for a second search, hoping to catch someone off guard. Once, in November 1849, a group of 4 catchers stayed in the main hall for 3 hours, eating dinner that Elizabeth served while 5 fugitives stood pressed behind the wall 10 feet away. The catchers had brought their own food, suspicious that Elizabeth might poison them, but they accepted her coffee and her hospitality. Elizabeth later said that was the longest 3 hours of her life. She served food with trembling hands hidden beneath long sleeves. She made conversation about weather and crops and local gossip. She asked about their work, forcing herself to sound interested as they described catching a family of runaways 2 weeks prior. She laughed at their jokes, though every joke was about the subhuman nature of Negroes and the stupidity of fugitives who thought they could outsmart white men. And the entire time, 5 people stood behind her wall, listening to men describe torturing people like them, listening to their own dehumanization spoken casually over dinner, staying absolutely silent, breathing through their noses to minimize sound, fighting the urge to cough or shift position or scream or weep. One of the 5 fugitives was a woman named Rebecca, who had been branded on her face by her master as punishment for learning to read. She stood behind the wall listening to slave catchers laugh about branding runaways and had to remain silent. Another was a man named Thomas, whose wife had been sold south 3 months earlier and who had escaped specifically to earn money to purchase her freedom. He stood listening to catchers discuss separating families as good business practice. The psychological torture of those 3 hours was in some ways worse than the physical torture these people had already survived. The close calls became routine in a way that should have been impossible but somehow became normal. In 12 years, slave catchers searched the Freeman farm 47 times. 47 times they walked through the main hall, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, sometimes staying minutes, sometimes staying hours. 47 times they stood feet from the fugitives, so close the fugitives could smell them, could hear their breathing, could hear them discussing where to search next. 47 times they found nothing. Some searches were perfunctory, young bounty hunters going through the motions to say they'd checked the Freeman property. Some were thorough, experienced catchers with years of finding hidden spaces and hidden people. The most dangerous search came in July 1852, and it nearly ended everything. A slave catcher named William Morrison, nephew of the plantation owner Andrew Morrison, had become deeply suspicious of the Freeman farm over the preceding year. Morrison was 28 years old, intelligent, methodical, and convinced that the Freemans were involved in helping fugitives escape. His evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Too many fugitives were escaping from the 3 surrounding plantations. The Morrison, Crawford, and Whitfield plantations had collectively lost 41 enslaved people in the 4 years between 1848 and 1852. 41 people had vanished without trace. Some must have died in the forests or swamps. Some must have been caught by other catchers working different territories. But Morrison suspected many had been helped, and the Freeman farm was the only property in the area with known abolitionist connections. Elizabeth's father had been openly anti-slavery. Elizabeth herself had traveled to Philadelphia multiple times, which Morrison found suspicious. And Marcus, though he had free papers, had never satisfactorily explained his origins when questioned. Morrison decided to conduct an extensive search, the kind that would find anything hidden. He arrived with 6 other catchers, men he'd hired specifically for this job, and a sheriff's warrant that gave him legal authority to search every structure on the property. "We're searching every inch of this property," Morrison told Elizabeth when she answered the door. "And we're taking our time. We'll be here all day if necessary." This was different. This was systematic. This was dangerous. Behind the wall at that moment stood 4 fugitives. A man named Samuel, age 42, who had escaped from Crawford Plantation 3 days earlier. A woman named Mary, age 35, and her 2 daughters, ages 11 and 8, who had escaped from Whitfield Plantation 5 days earlier. Samuel had seen slave catchers torture his brother to death 2 weeks prior. Mary had watched her oldest son sold away 6 months earlier. The 2 young girls had never known anything but slavery and terror. Now they stood pressed together in a space 3 feet deep, knowing that 7 slave catchers were about to search for them specifically. Marcus was in the barn being questioned aggressively by 3 of the catchers when the search began. They asked about his papers. They asked where he was born. They asked how he came to Virginia. They asked why a free Negro would work for a white woman instead of seeking better opportunities up north. Marcus answered every question with practiced humility. Yes, sir. No, sir. Playing the role of simple Negro grateful for employment. But he could see the main house from the barn, could see catchers entering, and his heart was in his throat. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing food at Morrison's demand, maintaining her composure while her hands shook so badly she had to grip the counter to steady them. She could hear boots stomping through her house, hear men shouting to each other about what they'd found. Nothing so far. Keep looking. She could hear them in the main hall, directly below her bedroom, directly where 4 human beings stood trying not to exist. The search lasted 6 hours. They searched systematically, starting from the top floor and working down. They checked the attic, looking for spaces between rafters. They checked bedrooms, moving furniture, checking under beds, opening wardrobes, looking for loose floorboards. They checked the kitchen, the pantry, the root cellar. Then they came to the main hall. 3 catchers entered together, spreading out to examine the space from different angles. Behind the wall, Samuel held Mary's 2 daughters, one hand over each girl's mouth, not to silence them. They were already silent, but to comfort them, to let them know someone was protecting them. Mary stood behind them, her eyes closed, praying silently. All 4 were pressed against the back wall of the hidden space, trying to minimize their physical presence, trying to become invisible through sheer will. The catchers walked the perimeter of the room. One catcher tapped walls with his knuckles, listening for hollow sounds. He tapped the north wall, where the fireplace was. Solid. He tapped the west wall. Solid. He tapped the south wall. Solid. He tapped the east wall. This was the real east wall, the one that hadn't been moved. It sounded solid because it was solid. He didn't tap the false wall because he didn't realize it existed. To his eyes, he had just tapped all 4 walls. The room had been thoroughly checked. Another catcher examined the bookshelf, the one that concealed the entrance to the hidden space. He ran his hands along the shelves. He pulled out books randomly, examining them, replacing them. He pushed against the bookshelf to see if it would move. It didn't move because Marcus had locked it from outside. The locking mechanism was invisible, integrated into the decorative woodwork. The catcher saw a permanent piece of furniture, old and solid and obviously part of the original room. He moved on. The third catcher, William Morrison himself, was not satisfied. He stood in the center of the room, slowly turning, studying everything. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the floor. He looked at the walls. Something felt wrong to him, though he couldn't articulate what. The room felt slightly off balance in some way he couldn't identify. He walked to the east wall and placed his hand flat against it. Behind that wall, 12 inches from his hand, Samuel stood with Mary's daughters. Morrison stood there for a full minute, hand on the wall, thinking. Then he moved to the false wall. He placed his hand on it. Behind the wall, 4 people stopped breathing entirely. Morrison's hand was touching the wood that separated him from his bounty. 4 fugitives. $200 in rewards. So close. But the wall felt solid. The paint looked old. The wood looked original. There was no evidence of recent construction, no sawdust, no fresh paint smell, no gaps or seams. Morrison pulled his hand away. "Nothing here," he said finally. But Morrison wasn't finished with his suspicions. He walked outside and paced the perimeter of the house, counting steps. 23 steps along the north side, 23 steps along the south side, 18 steps along the east side, 18 steps along the west side. Then he went back inside and paced the interior. The main hall ran east to west. He counted steps, 15 steps. 15 steps from the false wall to the west wall. But the house exterior had measured 18 steps. 3 steps were missing. Morrison called Elizabeth from the kitchen. "Your main hall is smaller than the exterior dimensions of your house," he said. "Where's the missing space?" Elizabeth had prepared for this exact question, had practiced the answer 100 times. She remained completely calm. "The chimney and its surrounding brickwork take up considerable space," she said. "Would you like me to show you?" She took Morrison to the north wall where the fireplace was. She explained that the chimney structure was massive, requiring a 4-foot-deep brick foundation that extended beyond the visible fireplace. She showed him how the chimney ran up through the second floor and attic. She explained that older houses like hers were built with deliberately thick walls for insulation, using a double-wall construction method that ate up interior space. She spoke with the confidence of someone explaining simple architecture to someone who didn't understand it. Morrison examined the chimney. She was right. The brick structure was massive, at least 4 feet deep. That accounted for most of the missing space. The rest could plausibly be explained by wall thickness. Morrison measured again. He checked his calculations. Grudgingly, he admitted she might be correct, but his instincts still told him something was wrong. He spent another hour searching the main hall, looking for anything irregular. He found nothing. After 6 hours total, Morrison admitted defeat. They had searched everything. Found nothing. No hidden rooms, no secret passages, no fugitives. They left. Elizabeth stood at the window and watched them ride away down the road. She waited until they were completely out of sight. Then she collapsed in a chair, her entire body shaking with the adrenaline release. Marcus returned from the barn. His hands were shaking too. Together, they waited another 30 minutes to be absolutely certain the catchers weren't doubling back. Then Marcus opened the bookshelf. The 4 fugitives emerged slowly, stiffly. They had stood in that space for 6 hours straight. Samuel's legs gave out immediately and he fell to the floor. Mary was crying silently. Her 2 daughters were in shock, pale, staring at nothing. All 4 were covered in sweat despite the cool temperature. One of the girls had wet herself, unable to hold it during the 6-hour ordeal. Marcus carried her upstairs while Elizabeth helped Mary. They gave the fugitives water, food, clean clothes. They let them rest for 3 days before attempting to move them north. During those 3 days, Samuel told Marcus, "I will never forget what you did. Never. You saved our lives." Marcus replied, "The wall saved your lives. Elizabeth saved your lives. I just built it." But Samuel shook his head. "You risked everything. Both of you. If Morrison had found us, they would have killed you. Both of you. And you did it anyway. For strangers. That's something I'll tell my grandchildren." 3 days later, Marcus guided Samuel, Mary, and the 2 girls to the Maryland border. They made it to Philadelphia. Samuel became a barber. Mary worked as a seamstress. The 2 girls grew up free, educated, safe. In 1891, 39 years after standing behind the wall, one of those girls, now a woman of 47, traveled to Virginia to meet Marcus and Elizabeth. She brought her own children and grandchildren. She showed them the farm. She showed them the main hall. She showed them the wall that had saved her life. She told them, "These people are why you exist. These people chose your freedom over their safety." That visit, Marcus later said, made everything worth it. After that incident, Marcus and Elizabeth discussed closing the operation for hours that stretched into days. The risk was becoming too great. Morrison was suspicious and wouldn't stop investigating. Other catchers were becoming more thorough in their searches, learning from each failed attempt. One mistake, one fugitive who panicked and made noise, one structural failure in the wall would mean death for Marcus, years in prison for Elizabeth, and capture or death for any fugitives present. Virginia law prescribed death by hanging for enslaved people who helped others escape. It prescribed 10 years imprisonment for white people who aided fugitives. But they also knew that the wall was working beyond all reasonable expectations. 47 searches, 0 discoveries. That success rate was statistically impossible, yet undeniably real. Fugitives were making it to freedom. The 3 plantations surrounding their farm, Morrison, Crawford, and Whitfield, were losing enslaved people regularly, and those losses represented families reunited, people freed, children born into freedom rather than slavery. The system undermined one person at a time. Each loss cost plantation owners money, made slavery less profitable, proved the system was vulnerable. They decided to continue. But they needed to be even more careful, even more disciplined, even more paranoid. Marcus refined the protocols until they were nearly perfect. Fugitives could only arrive at night, between midnight and 4 a.m. when roads were emptiest. They stayed in the barn during daylight hours if no searches were imminent, moving to the house only after dark. They used the wall only when absolutely necessary, only when catchers were actively searching. Marcus created a secondary warning system using bells. If Elizabeth saw slave catchers approaching from the distance, she would ring the dinner bell once. That meant probable search within 30 minutes, prepare mentally. If she rang it 3 times rapidly, that meant catchers at the door right now, into the wall immediately. The system worked flawlessly. Between 1852 and 1859, they hid 43 more fugitives using these refined protocols. The wall was searched 23 more times during those 7 years. No one was ever caught. The system had become as close to perfect as any human endeavor could be. But the operation took a tremendous toll on both of them, a psychological and emotional price that compounded with every year. Marcus and Elizabeth lived under constant stress that never truly ended. Every knock on the door could be a search that exposed everything. Every stranger riding past the farm could be an informant watching their movements. Every fugitive they sheltered could be the one whose panic or mistake destroyed them all. They could never relax fully, never let their guard down completely, never enjoy a moment of peace without calculating risks and preparing for disaster. The stress manifested physically. Elizabeth developed chronic headaches that lasted days. Marcus's hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. Both had nightmares about the wall failing, about fugitives being discovered, about hangings and imprisonments and torture. But beyond the operational stress was the personal torture of their hidden marriage. Their private marriage remained absolutely secret for 31 years after the war ended. Elizabeth's neighbors and the broader community knew her as a respectable Christian widow with a Negro servant named Marcus. If anyone suspected the truth, if anyone realized Marcus and Elizabeth were living as husband and wife, sharing a bed, loving each other as equals, both would be destroyed. Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws remained in force until 1967. Even a rumor of interracial intimacy could result in mob violence. They had no children together, though both wanted them desperately. Too risky. A mixed-race child would expose everything immediately. A child who resembled Marcus would reveal their relationship. A child who resembled Elizabeth might pass as white, but would still raise questions about paternity. They discussed adoption, but that too would invite scrutiny. So they remained childless, watching fugitive families pass through their home, helping reunite parents with children, knowing they could never have that themselves. They had no close friends for the same reason. Friends asked personal questions, noticed inconsistencies, might accidentally discover the truth. They lived in profound isolation, together but unable to show that togetherness publicly, married but unable to acknowledge that marriage, in love but required to perform indifference or employer-servant dynamics whenever anyone else was present. The loneliness was crushing in ways that are difficult for people in normal relationships to fully comprehend. They could never hold hands in public, never show affection in front of others, never call each other by terms of endearment where someone might hear, never attend social functions as a couple, never share their true relationship with anyone. The performance was exhausting and unending. But they had each other. At night, in their bedroom with the door locked and curtains drawn, they could be themselves. They could talk freely. They could show affection. They could plan and dream and laugh. These private moments sustained them through the public performance. And they had the fugitives, 87 people who passed through their home. Each one represented a victory. Each one justified the risk. Marcus kept a coded journal documenting everyone they helped. Not names, which would be too dangerous if discovered, but numbers. Age, plantation of origin, date arrived, date departed, final destination if known. By 1859, the journal listed 87 entries. 87 people who had stood behind the wall while slave catchers searched. 87 people who had eaten at their table, slept in their barn, received forged papers and supplies. 87 people who had made it to freedom because of a false wall in a main hall and a couple willing to risk everything. The end came not from discovery but from war. By 1859, tensions between North and South were reaching a breaking point. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 terrified white Virginians. Slave patrols intensified. Suspicion of abolitionists became paranoia. Operating the Underground Railroad became exponentially more dangerous. In December 1859, Marcus and Elizabeth helped their last fugitive reach Maryland, a woman named Sarah, age 34, with 3 children. Getting a woman and 3 children to safety required exceptional planning. Marcus and Elizabeth kept them for 2 weeks, waiting for the safest route. Slave catchers searched twice during those 2 weeks. Both times, Sarah and her children stood behind the wall. The youngest child was 4 years old. Marcus had explained to him before the first search, "We're playing a game. The game is staying very quiet. Can you do that?" The boy nodded. When the catchers searched, the boy stayed silent, holding his mother's hand. He won the game. Sarah and her children made it to Canada. They were the last. In January 1860, Marcus and Elizabeth decided to close the operation. War was coming. Virginia would become a battlefield. Operating an underground railroad station in a war zone would be suicide. They had done enough. 87 people, 12 years, 0 captures. They decided to keep the wall but stop using it actively. If fugitives arrived desperate and with no other options, they would still help, but they would no longer advertise the farm as a station. The Civil War began in April 1861. Virginia seceded and joined the Confederacy. Loudoun County became a contested region, with Union and Confederate forces moving through regularly. The Freeman farm, like all farms in the area, was raided by both sides. Union soldiers came in July 1861 looking for food and supplies. Elizabeth was prepared for this. She gave them vegetables, some livestock, and information about Confederate troop movements she'd observed. The Union soldiers thanked her and left. Confederate soldiers came in September 1861, also looking for supplies. Elizabeth was prepared for this, too. She gave them food and claimed total ignorance about Union movements. The Confederate soldiers were more suspicious. "Where's your Negro?" one asked. "Working in the fields," Elizabeth said. "Call him here." Elizabeth called for Marcus. He came, playing his role perfectly, subservient, eyes down, speaking only when spoken to. The Confederate soldiers questioned him. Where was he from? Who owned him? Elizabeth interrupted. I have his free papers if you'd like to see them. She showed the forged manumission papers. The soldiers examined them, found them in order, and left. But one soldier looked back as they departed. His expression suggested suspicion. After that visit, Marcus and Elizabeth knew they needed to be even more careful. Confederate authorities were watching for Union sympathizers. A white woman with a black servant living alone without a white male protector was automatically suspicious. They discussed Marcus leaving, going north to Union territory where he'd be safe. But Marcus refused. I'm not leaving you, he said. If they come for you, they come for both of us. Elizabeth agreed. They would survive together or fall together. The war years were brutal. Food became scarce. Money became worthless. Raiders from both armies stole livestock and supplies. The farm barely produced enough to survive. But Marcus and Elizabeth endured. And in those years, despite their decision to close the operation, they helped 11 more fugitives. Not through the Underground Railroad network, which had collapsed in Virginia, but through desperate individuals who appeared at their door with nowhere else to go. The wall was used 3 more times during the war. Once when Confederate soldiers searched the house in 1862 while 2 fugitives hid behind it. Once when bounty hunters, still operating despite the war, searched in 1863 with 3 fugitives present. Once when a Confederate patrol conducted a surprise search in 1864 with 1 fugitive behind the wall. All 3 times, the wall held. No one was discovered. The Confederacy collapsed in April 1865. The war ended. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. Marcus Freeman was legally free. For the first time in his life, his freedom wasn't dependent on forged papers or pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was simply free. Marcus and Elizabeth thought they could finally live openly as husband and wife. They thought wrong. Interracial marriage remained illegal in Virginia until 1967, 102 years later. Even after the war, even after emancipation, Virginia law forbade marriages between white and black people. Marcus and Elizabeth had 2 choices: leave Virginia or continue their performance. They chose to stay. The farm was theirs. The land was theirs. Their work was rooted there. They continued living as employer and servant publicly and as husband and wife privately. They lived this way for another 31 years. Marcus Freeman died in April 1896 at age 81. He had lived 51 years as a fugitive, 30 years under a false identity, and only 6 years legally free in a marriage still not recognized by Virginia. Elizabeth Freeman lived another 12 years. She died in June 1908 at age 89. Before her death, Elizabeth wrote a detailed account of their 12 years operating the Underground Railroad station. She described the wall. She described the 87 fugitives. She described Marcus's courage and intelligence. She described their secret marriage and the loneliness of living a lie. She gave this account to a Quaker historian who published it in 1910 under the title The Wall in the Hall, a true account of Underground Railroad operations in Loudoun County, Virginia. The account was largely ignored at the time. White historians doubted its veracity. The story seemed too dramatic, too dangerous, too unlikely. A false wall in the main hall? An interracial couple operating for 12 years? 87 fugitives passing through without a single capture? It sounded like fiction. But descendants of the fugitives confirmed the story. Oral histories in black communities in Canada and northern states mentioned the Freeman farm, the wall, the couple who risked everything. In 1948, historians visited the farmhouse, which still stood, though in disrepair. They examined the main hall. They found the false wall. It was still there, perfectly preserved. The bookshelf, the hidden space, the ventilation system, all exactly as Elizabeth had described. Physical evidence of an engineering miracle and moral courage. The farmhouse was purchased by a historical preservation society in 1952. The wall was carefully documented and preserved. Today, the Freeman Farm is a museum. Visitors can see the main hall. They can see the bookshelf. They can see the hidden space where 87 people hid. They can stand in that space, press themselves against the back wall. Imagine what it felt like to stand there for hours while slave catchers searched 3 feet away. The museum displays Marcus's coded journal, listing all 87 fugitives. It displays Elizabeth's written account. It displays the forged freedom papers that allowed Marcus to live in Virginia. It displays letters from descendants of fugitives thanking Marcus and Elizabeth for saving their ancestors. The story of Marcus and Elizabeth Freeman is a story about courage, certainly, about 2 people who risked death and imprisonment to help others escape slavery. But it's also a story about love, about a relationship that violated every law and social custom of their time, about a couple who lived a lie publicly so they could live their truth privately, about choosing each other every day for 31 years despite the constant danger, about building something together, literally and figuratively, that saved lives. The wall in the hall was a masterpiece of deception and engineering. But it was more than that. It was a symbol that sometimes the safest place to hide is in plain sight. A symbol that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when motivated by love and principle. A symbol that walls can protect as well as divide. 87 people passed through that wall between 1847 and 1860. Some stayed hours, some stayed weeks. All of them survived. All of them reached freedom. Because Marcus Freeman understood carpentry and courage. Because Elizabeth Freeman understood that privilege meant responsibility. Because together they built something that seemed impossible and made it work through meticulous planning, flawless performance, and absolute commitment. Virginia tried to erase this story, tried to ignore it, tried to claim it was exaggerated or false. But the wall exists, the documentation exists, the descendants exist, the truth exists. Marcus Freeman, born enslaved 1815, died free 1896. Blacksmith, fugitive, Underground Railroad conductor, husband, hero. Elizabeth Freeman, born free 1819, died free 1908. Daughter of abolitionists, Underground Railroad station master, wife, hero. Together they saved 87 lives. Together they proved that love can survive and thrive even in the most hostile conditions. Together they built a wall that protected the powerless from those hunting them. Remember Marcus and Elizabeth Freeman. Remember the wall in the hall. Remember that resistance takes many forms, that courage looks different for different people, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is choosing love when the world demands hate. Remember that 87 people stood behind that wall and lived because 2 people decided their lives mattered more than law or custom or safety. The Freeman Farm still stands in Loudoun County, Virginia. The wall is still there. You can visit it. You can stand behind that wall. You can feel the weight of history pressing against you. You can imagine standing there in the darkness, hearing slave catchers 3 feet away, fighting the urge to breathe too loudly, trusting that the wall will hold, trusting that Marcus and Elizabeth will protect you. That wall held for 12 years. It held through 47 searches. It held when William Morrison measured rooms and tapped walls and suspected but couldn't prove anything. It held when Confederate soldiers searched during the war. It held every single time because Marcus Freeman built it perfectly, and Elizabeth Freeman performed perfectly. And together they created something that seemed impossible. 87 people, 12 years, 0 captures. This happened. This was real, and it must never be forgotten.